He was the man who made the world scream, yet died in silence. Edward Allan Fast, Eddie Clarke, the guitarist who gave Motorhead its soul, was someone to whom rock and roll owes a debt of gratitude. He didn't just play music, he detonated it, turning anger, poverty, and loneliness into molten sound. But bitterly, while Lemmy Kilmister was praised as the saint of rock, Clarke, the man behind the legendary riffs of Ace of Spades and Overkill, was forgotten even while he was still alive. From a poor boy in Twickenham, the son of a failed jazz musician, to the man who had to walk away from the very band he helped build at the height of fame, Clarke's life was a chain of contradictions and losses. He sacrificed everything to preserve the truest sound he could create, and the price was a lifelong solitude that lasted until his final breath. How could a genius build an entire era of music only to be forgotten by the world? That question is not just about fame, but about the tragedy of a man who lived faster than the legend he created. Born in 1950 in Twickenham, a working-class district in southwest London where the houses were covered in coal dust and the clatter of machinery filled the air day and night, Edward Allan Clarke grew up in a world that left no room for dreams. The air smelled of rust and oil. People kept their heads down, working endlessly, waiting for payday only to start the same weary cycle again. In that setting, a skinny boy with messy hair and distant eyes already knew he didn't belong there. His parents divorced when he was very young. Eddie lived with his mother, a quiet, resilient woman enduring long, hard days in a dim little house surrounded by the noise of the industrial neighborhood. His father, a jazz bassist who played in local pubs, was the only figure who ever lit a spark of difference in him. Not through lofty words, but through the kind of music that ran in his veins, the sound of freedom in a world imprisoned by machines. One day, fortune briefly smiled on his father. He won a bet at the racetrack. Instead of keeping the money, he spent it all on a guitar for his son. 15 pounds for a small, worn instrument with slightly rusted strings. To Eddie, it was a portal to another universe. He held it like a promise, a vow that he would escape. For 3 weeks straight, he taught himself to play, practicing until his fingertips bled, just to master Summertime. When that first note rang out in the damp little room, it wasn't just music, it was a declaration. I will live differently. But life had no mercy for dreamers. At 15, Eddie was forced to quit school and work. He started repairing televisions, then moved into a metal workshop, a place thick with smoke and oil fumes, where people spoke only a few words a day and their calloused hands repeated the same motion for hours. To him, it was an invisible prison. Every morning, when the hammers began to strike, Eddie felt his heart turning to iron. What terrified him wasn't the hard labor. It was the thought of spending an entire lifetime trapped in that rhythm, day after day, year after year, until every dream was ground down to dust. Then one sweltering afternoon, amid the deafening clang of machines, Eddie looked around. Gray faces, hollow eyes, an air so heavy with hopelessness, it was hard to breathe. He knew that if he stayed, he'd become one of them, dying slowly, unnoticed. In that instant, the decision was made without hesitation. No money, no plan, only an old guitar and a fragile belief that somewhere out there, music was waiting for him. The workshop door closed behind him, the sound of metal striking metal echoing like the shattering of an old life. Eddie walked away and didn't look back. It was his first leap of faith, the moment that tore him from the darkness of Twickenham and began his journey to turn the noise of steel, oil, and smoke into music. From that moment on, fate had chosen him. and the world was about to witness how a nameless mechanic would become the soul of rock and roll, armed with nothing but his calloused hands, his lonely heart, and a fire that would never die. The road ahead was anything but easy. From the 1960s through the mid-1970s came the harshest trial of Eddie Clarke's life, a crucible in which every spark of hope was extinguished, yet from which the purest metal within him was forged, the instinct never to surrender. After leaving the workshop, Eddie began playing in small London bands during the explosion of British rock led by Cream, Led Zeppelin, and Deep Purple. But instead of bright lights and roaring crowds, he found himself in dingy pubs with broken speakers and half-drunk audiences. His first band, The Bitter End, lasted only a few months, true to its name. Yet that was where Eddie learned his most important lesson. If you want to be heard, you have to play with every ounce of rage and longing in your heart. A few years later, fortune seemed to smile when he was invited to join Zeus, the band of Curtis Knight, the same Curtis Knight who had once played alongside Jimi Hendrix in his early days. With Zeus, Eddie entered the professional world for the first time at Olympic Studios, where the Rolling Stones had recorded. In 1974, they made the album The Second Coming, a title that sounded prophetic, but turned out to be tragic. Despite flashes of brilliance, especially The Confession, a heavy blues-soaked track written by Eddie himself, steeped in guilt and redemption, critics and audiences alike ignored it. The album flopped, and Zeus disbanded. Unwilling to give up, Eddie founded Blue Goose, then Continuous Performance with Charlie Tuma High, later of Bebop Deluxe. They recorded countless demos and sent them everywhere, but no record label cared. Each rejection letter cut deeper into his pride. Clarke began to believe that perhaps art had abandoned him. In the pubs after failed gigs, he sat in silence, beer in hand, eyes empty, not from drunkenness, but from no longer knowing what purpose his guitar still served. By 1975, everything had fallen apart. No band, no contract, no money. Eddie gave up music and returned to manual labor. He worked repairing boats on the Thames. Then, as a plumber, the kind of job he thought he had left behind forever. Each morning, holding a wrench instead of a guitar, he felt as if he were burying himself alive. Yet in that despair, fate was quietly preparing its next twist. A year later, just when the dream seemed dead, a chance meeting with drummer Phil "Filthy Animal" Taylor, who happened to be working for Eddie at the time, opened the door that would lead Clarke into the world of Motörhead. From that moment on, his name would be forever tied to the most iconic metal sound of the century. From the depths of failure, rock and roll was calling him back, and this time, it would never let go. Those years that seemed to end his musical dream would, by accident, unlock destiny. When Eddie Clarke put down his guitar to earn a living, he didn't know that the same hands used to fix boats would soon bring him to the encounter that would change rock history. On an old houseboat, moored along the Thames in Chelsea, where Eddie had taken plumbing work, he met Phil "Filthy Animal" Taylor, a fiery young drummer working under him. During breaks, amid the smell of oil and metal, they talked about blues, about Cream, about the gigs they thought they'd never play again. Phil sensed something still burning inside Eddie, a flame buried under ash. He immediately introduced him to Lemmy Kilmister, the leader of Motörhead, a band on its last breath after a string of failures, short on both a guitarist and hope. From here, the story splits like legend. Some say Phil Taylor himself brought Eddie to the audition. But in Lemmy's autobiography, another version emerges. Gertie, the receptionist at the rehearsal studio, and Eddie's girlfriend at the time, was the real link. She mentioned Eddie to Lemmy just as he was desperately searching for a new guitarist. Whoever lit the spark, the result was the same. A massive explosion was about to shake the world of heavy metal. The first jam took place at Snob's studio, inside an old warehouse called the Furniture Cave in Chelsea. The place was cold, damp, and bare. Just three strangers, Lemmy, Phil, and Eddie, and a few battered amplifiers. But when the first guitar riff rang out, Lemmy stopped, looked up at Eddie, and knew he'd heard something that hadn't existed before. Lemmy's bass, Phil's drums, and Eddie's guitar collided into a wild, abrasive sound, part punk, part metal, yet entirely its own. It was the sound of war, the birth of what would later be known as the Motörhead sound. By 1977, the band was on the verge of collapse. They were broke, hungry, exhausted, and ready to quit. Lemmy even planned a farewell gig at London's Marquee Club, the same stage once graced by legends. But fate intervened again. That farewell show caught the attention of Chiswick Records. Right after that night, they were signed and recorded 13 songs, including the single Motorhead, released the same year. From ashes, an icon rose. From three lost souls, a new definition of rock was born. The name Motörhead, once dismissed as unmarketable noise, became a declaration of life itself. "We're not here to please anyone. We're here to blow it all to hell." That moment transformed Eddie Clarke from a mechanic into one of the pillars of British heavy metal. And from then on, together with Lemmy and Phil, he would turn the darkness of poverty into the blazing age of metal, an era forged in sweat, blood, and the heartbeat that never stopped. From that fateful night at the Marquee Club, Motörhead rose like an unstoppable metal storm. What the three of them created was no longer just music. It was a raw, primal life force so pure and ferocious that even punk and metal had to bow before it. At the center of that whirlwind stood Eddie Clarke, the man who once toiled in the smoky workshops of Twickenham, now turning his guitar into a torch that set the world on fire. In 1979, they released Overkill, the explosive album that lifted Motörhead out of poverty and onto the UK charts at 24. With Overkill, Clarke found his signature sound, snarling punk chugs, riffs that roared like motorcycle engines, and Phil Taylor's relentless drumming that hit like a storm of bullets. In a decade when so many bands were still searching for identity, Clarke chose the extreme path, to play simpler, faster, heavier, and truer than anyone else. Less than 6 months later came Bomber, 1979, climbing to number 12 on the UK albums chart. It was more aggressive, less experimental than Overkill, the pure refinement of fire and steel. The Bomber tour left audiences stunned. The band appeared on stage beneath a massive bomber-shaped lighting rig. Eddie stood in the center, Gibson SG slung low, hammering riffs like a blacksmith at his forge, not showing off, not posing, just raw precision and force. He once said, "Every note has to serve the song, not my ego." But the true summit arrived in 1980 with Ace of Spades, the manifesto of an entire generation. The title single shot to Fracas 15 in the UK, and the album soared to Supper 4, Motörhead's highest charting ever. The cover, shot in the Barnet sand pit, transformed them into death cowboys lost in their own desert. Ace of Spades was the sound of adrenaline and bloodlust, fast, fierce, and lethal. Yet if you only listened without feeling, you'd miss the subtle brilliance in Clarke's playing. There was no flashiness, but every note carried a sense of urgency, as if he were gambling his life with every strum. Then came 1981's live album, No Sleep Till Hammersmith, which shot straight to number 1 on the UK albums chart. It wasn't just a live record, it was a it was a declaration of war, proof that Motörhead didn't need studios to make history. Every track, Ace of Spades, Overkill, The Hammer, was a battle, and Eddie was the frontline commander. When his solos screamed across the sea of roaring fans, it felt as if the sound itself dragged the whole crowd into hell and threw them back to life again. During those years, Eddie didn't just play, he sang. His voice was rough and raw but disarmingly honest. He sang lead on Step Down, Emergency, and shared vocals with Lemmy on Beer Drinkers and Hellraisers. One of the rare moments when those two powerful spirits blended their voices instead of clashing. By now, Motörhead had become a global phenomenon. Tours across Europe and America stretched for months. Sleepless nights, rushed meals backstage, endless flights that drained their bodies. Each night, Eddie's riffs hit the stage like weapons, both a mark of pride and a warning to himself. Behind the glory, cracks were forming. From the poor mechanic of Twickenham to an international star, Eddie Clarke had reached the summit of the world. But it was there that the silent fractures between the three began to surface. And when the sound grows too loud, sometimes it's strong enough to shatter the soul of the one who made it. Glory, however, always comes at a cost. After No Sleep Till Hammersmith, Motörhead entered its most brutal phase, not just on stage, but within. While audiences hailed them as the warriors of rock and roll, internal conflicts quietly corroded the bond that had built the legend. Eddie Clarke, the man who remained fiercely loyal to rock's pure spirit, began to feel lost amid the fame and the new direction Lemmy pursued. In 1982, they released Iron Fist, the final album of the Golden lineup. For Eddie, it marked the end, not because of poor sales, but because the soul of Motörhead no longer felt intact. Iron Fist sounded strong, harsh, but lacked the raw fire he and Lemmy once unleashed in Overkill or Ace of Spades. Clarke felt the album was crushed under commercial pressure. The riffs too polished, the mix too clean, missing the dirty, living breath that was their essence. Lemmy believed change was necessary to move forward. Clarke stood firm. Motörhead doesn't need to sound like anyone else. The final spark came when Lemmy decided to collaborate with Wendy O. Williams and the Plasmatics on the EP Stand By Your Man, a rock-punk take on the old country classic. To Lemmy, it was an interesting experiment. To Clarke, it was a betrayal of Motörhead's identity. He called it a dangerous dilution, believing it destroyed the gang-like, street-born image that fans loved. The argument exploded, fiercer than ever before. Lemmy accused Clarke of being narrow-minded. Phil Taylor, exhausted, just wanted out. No one listened anymore. Only silence remained between three men who had once rewritten the history of metal together. Years later, Clarke recalled in an interview, "I didn't quit. I was pushed out." A short sentence, yet it carried a decade of bitterness. It wasn't just the breakup of a band, it was the collapse of a family he once thought eternal. On May 14, 1982, at the New York Palladium, Motörhead played their final show with the classic lineup. When the last riff rang out and the lights dimmed, Eddie walked off stage. The night air was cold. The scent of smoke and beer hung heavy. Behind him, the crowd still screamed, "Fast Eddie!" But he didn't look back. In that moment, the man who once played the fastest, fiercest riffs took the slowest step of his life. Silent, solitary, walking away from the dream he had built. It remains one of the most haunting images in Motörhead's history. A man walking into the darkness, carrying with him the old soul of the band. But Eddie didn't yet know. When that door closed, another was opening. There, he would be reborn under a new name, Fastway, and continue writing the next chapter of his legend. When one door closed at the New York Palladium, Eddie Clarke had no idea that fate was waiting just around the corner. A few weeks after leaving Motörhead in a smoke-filled London bar, he met Pete Way. the legendary UFO bassist who had also just quit his band out of frustration. Both were wanderers in the world of rock, weary, misunderstood, but still carrying an ember that refused to die. They spent the whole night talking about music, about honesty in every note, and by morning they decided to create something new together. The name Fastway was born, a fusion of Fast, Eddie Clarke, and Way, Pete Way, symbolizing two men who lived fast, played real, and had nothing left to lose. With Irish singer Dave King, whose voice carried the raw breath of the blues, and drummer Jerry Shirley of Humble Pie, the first Fastway lineup took shape. In 1983, they released their debut album, Fastway, a powerful breakthrough on both sides of the Atlantic. 43 in the UK and the 31 in the US. The track, Say What You Will, became their declaration, wild yet yearning, a defiant answer to those who claimed Clarke was finished. With blues rock riffs, tight yet fiery structure, Eddie proved he didn't need Motörhead to survive. All he needed was his guitar and the belief that there was still room in rock for truth. What followed were years of relentless creativity, all fired up, 1984, fierce, multi-layered, full of energy, Waiting for the Roar, 1986, blending American hard rock with radio-friendly melodies, and the Trick or Treat 1986 film soundtrack, where Clarke brought his music to the big screen, cinematic, yet rebellious. At that time, Fastway became a familiar name on massive rock tours, even opening for AC/DC. Under the stage lights of America, Eddie stood in front of thousands, his Gibson guitar gleaming as he held each note as if trying to keep a piece of the past alive. Though successful, the wheel of music never stops turning. By the late 1980s, thrash and glam metal ruled the airwaves, faster, flashier, louder. Fastway began to fade, though the live album, Say What You Will Live, 1992, was still praised as proof of their raw vitality. When the band dissolved, Clarke found another way forward. He teamed up with Lee Hart to release On Target, 1988, merging modern metal sounds with his blues roots, and later his solo album, It Ain't Over Till It's Over, 1993, which included Laugh at the Devil, a late reconciliation with Lemmy, two souls who had once collided and drifted apart. When listeners heard Clarke sing, the arrogance of the Ace of Spades years was gone. What remained was a weary, gravelly voice, that of a man who had walked through both heaven and hell. In a quiet interview, he said, "I never played to be famous. I played to survive." Perhaps that was the truth he had been chasing all along. Every record, every tour, every comeback was his way of proving that no matter how the world changed, the true spirit of rock never dies. As the final storm of fame faded, Clarke returned to the very place it all began, the blues, the music of loneliness and truth. And from there, he rediscovered himself, not as Fast Eddie the stage warrior, but as Edward Allan Clarke, the man who once turned the noise of ordinary life into legend. By the end of the 1990s, Eddie Clarke seemed to retreat completely from the spotlight. But for a man whose breath was music, silence was never an ending, only the stillness before another storm. In the 2000s, he unexpectedly revived Fastway, the band that had slept quietly in the memories of the 1980s. This time, there was no rush, no need to prove anything. Clarke started over, slowly, precisely, with quiet determination. In 2007, Fastway returned to the stage at the Download Festival, one of the biggest metal events in the UK. As he stepped into the sea of people, thousands of young fans, most of them born long after Ace of Spades, shouted, "Fast Eddie!" It was one of the few moments he allowed himself to smile, not for the applause, but for the realization that true music never ages. 4 years later, Clarke released Eat Dog Eat, 2011, Fastway's first new album in over 2 decades. No longer chasing the past, he sought a more mature sound, a fusion of classic hard rock and modern rhythm. Songs like Leave the Light On and Sick as a Dog felt like confessions. The fire still burned, but now it glowed quietly in the dark. Dave King's voice had grown rougher and deeper, and Eddie's guitar still carried that familiar cold steel tone, but now tinged with melancholy, as if every riff were a memory of the days he and Lemmy once stood side by side. Then, in 2014, Clarke surprised everyone with Make My Day, Back to the Blues, a collaboration with Bill Sharp of Shack Attack. This was no longer fiery rock and roll. It was a homecoming. Clarke returned to the blues, the genre that had nurtured him since childhood, long before Motorhead. Tracks like Ain't Gonna Cry Again and Make My Day sounded simple, yet carried the wisdom of a man who had completed the circle, from the smoke of Twickenham workshops to the peak of the world and back to his own heart. I played to survive, he said again, but this time, it wasn't resistance. It was gratitude. That same year, Clarke stepped onto the stage at Birmingham's National Indoor Arena, where he and Lemmy Kilmister reunited one final time. Together, they played Ace of Spades, the song that defined both their lives. Lemmy was frail. Eddie's hair had turned gray. But when that opening riff tore through the air, time stood still. 2 old warriors smiled at each other. No anger left, only music. After that night, they would never share a stage again. In the quiet years that followed, as Fastway faded and touring became only a memory, Eddie met Maro Fujiwara, a Japanese film and music producer who brought an entirely new color into his life. They had first met in the early 1980s during a UK-Japan music collaboration project, when Eddie was composing for a soundtrack. Amid the noise and chaos of rock and roll, Maro appeared like a breath of calm, gentle, perceptive, and drawn to the man behind the fame rather than the legend on stage. Eddie, once accustomed to long nights' noise and chaos, grew quieter around her. He often said Maro taught him to hear the sound of silence again. She never asked him to change, but her patience helped him learn to slow down, to put the guitar down after rehearsals, to walk with her along the Thames, or to sit listening to his father's old jazz records. They married without fanfare, no big ceremony, just a few close friends in a small London room. Eddie didn't wear a suit, just his old leather jacket, and smiled when Maro told him, "I don't need you to be a star. I just need you to still hear your own heartbeat." Their marriage was so simple, it felt unreal. No headlines, no scandals, no gulf of fame. Eddie often said that after years of running, he had finally found a place to rest. They had no children, but they adopted a small dog named Cookie, whom Eddie jokingly called the only kid in the house. To them, Cookie symbolized the peaceful life they had once thought impossible. In his later years, as Clarke's health declined from lung disease, Maro cared for him tenderly. Every meal, every pill, every breath. She rarely left his side, sometimes simply holding his hand and listening to his labored breathing after another long coughing fit. Their love was not a Hollywood romance, but a quiet devotion, the kind that kept him alive through illness and solitude. Yet deep down, Eddie remained a man divided between 2 worlds, one filled with the roaring riffs that once shook arenas, and another, a small London room, where he sat beside his Japanese wife, softly playing the blues as the evening light faded over the Thames. After 2015, following the deaths of Lemmy and Phil Taylor, Eddie Clarke seemed to change completely. He still played music, still carried that steadfast look, but there was a quiet weariness in his eyes. Friends said he began to breathe heavily on stage. His coughing fits lasted longer, and his right hand, the same hand that had unleashed thousands of storm-like riffs, sometimes trembled when holding the guitar. He never spoke about his illness, only shrugged and said, "I'm just getting old." But the truth was that his health was slowly failing. The chronic pneumonia that had lingered for years began after a tour in Germany, where he had performed in freezing weather while suffering from a cold. Clarke brushed it off, kept drinking beer, kept smoking, kept playing until exhaustion, as if trying to prove that music was stronger than the body. But when he returned to London, the condition worsened. He was hospitalized several times but kept sneaking out, telling doctors, "I wasn't born to lie still." By the end of 2017, the illness came back with a vengeance. He needed oxygen to breathe. The infection had spread deep into his lungs, and each breath grew harder. Yet every morning, Clarke still tried to play, sitting by the window of his small house in West London, letting the cold light fall across his old Les Paul. People who saw him said he seemed to live between two worlds, half in music, half in the fatigue of a fading body. Maro Fujiwara, his devoted wife, barely left his side. She mixed his medicine, wiped his forehead, and listened as he muttered fragments about Lemmy, about the old tours, about that sound only the three of us understood. Sometimes, between fits of coughing, he would grin. "If they're playing somewhere out there, I bet they're saving me a spot." January 2018 brought cold rain to London. In a small hospital in the city's West End, Edward Allan "Fast Eddie Clarke ended his journey after weeks of battling pneumonia. He passed away on January 10, 2018, aged 67, with Maro by his side, his hand still resting on his old guitar, as if there was one last riff he hadn't finished playing. They said he went quietly, without warning, just as he had lived, honest, calm, unpretentious. He was laid to rest at Twickenham Cemetery, only a few streets from where he grew up. A circle completed. The man who had once escaped the working-class smoke to chase music now returned to where it all began, surrounded by mist and memory. Old neighbors, loyal fans, and a few close friends came to say goodbye. There were no stage lights, no roaring crowd. Only the sound of earth falling softly over the wooden coffin, light yet heavy with the weight of an entire rock and roll era. When the news broke, the rock world was stunned. Major outlets called him the last surviving member of Motörhead's immortal lineup. Lemmy Kilmister had passed at the end of 2015, just 2 months after Phil "Filthy Animal" Taylor, and now Clarke was gone. For a moment, the world seemed to realize Overkill, Ace of Spades, No Sleep Till Hammersmith, all that remained were the sounds, no longer the men behind them. Dave Ellefson of Megadeth wrote, "One of the last true rock and roll guitar heroes has gone." People didn't cry out of shock. They cried because they understood that a glorious chapter of music had truly closed. The three of them, Lemmy, Phil, and Eddie, had once forged the sound of hell itself, a chaotic miracle that defined a generation. And now, all of them had fallen silent. But even though the final note has stopped, the echo remains. In every riff, every drum beat, every old live recording still played in some bar at midnight. And somewhere far beyond, people like to believe that the three of them are together again. Lemmy grinning that rough grin, Phil pounding his drums with wild abandon, and Eddie, as always, standing quietly in the corner, keeping time, just to make sure the world never stops shaking. After Eddie Clarke's passing, it felt as though rock music had lost one of its quietest heartbeats. The press wrote about him with reverence and regret, but those who truly knew him understood this. Fame was never what he sought. What Clarke left behind wasn't measured in numbers or medals. It was an unreplicable sound, one that forced the world to see rock and roll through new eyes. Eddie Clarke didn't invent speed metal, but he laid its foundation. From Overkill to Ace of Spades, his riffs merged the raw grit of punk with the heavy weight of metal, creating an entirely new musical language. Bands that came later, from Metallica and Slayer to Anthrax, all admitted they learned from Motörhead the art of playing as if tomorrow doesn't exist. Clarke never played to perform. He played as if it was the only way to survive. What made him different wasn't just technique, it was attitude. While many artists lost themselves in lights and praise, Clarke chose silence, letting the music speak. He didn't need to stand before a crowd to prove himself. All he needed was a guitar and a riff strong enough to shake the room. Maybe that's why, after more than half a century, his sound remains untamed, raw, real, and uncompromising. Today, when people talk about Motörhead, they think of Lemmy's gravelly voice or Phil Taylor's frenzied drumming. But it was Clarke who held everything together, turning chaos into structure, noise into soul. He was the invisible thread that kept the storm from tearing itself apart. And when he left, the sound that once made the world tremble seemed to fade with him. At Twickenham Cemetery, his grave rests beneath old trees. No grand marker, no monument, just a small engraving. Fast Eddie Clarke, 1950-2018. Simple, like the man himself. Yet anyone who ever heard him play knows that beneath that quiet earth lies a heart that once beat in rhythm with thunder. Some say rock and roll is a rebellion that never ends. But for Clarke, it wasn't just rebellion. It was a way of life. He played, he loved, he failed and rose again. He burned through everything just to hold on to one thing: honesty in music. And perhaps in the final silence of the world, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear a familiar riff, the sound of Fast Eddie Clarke, echoing like the heartbeat of an era that never truly died. Because some people don't need monuments to be remembered. They live on in the sound they left behind. And if Eddie Clarke had one last thing to say to us, it might be a simple question. When the music stops, can you still hear yourself? Fast Eddie Clarke, the mechanic who turned the world's noise into the heartbeat of rock and roll, is gone. But his spirit still resonates in every note. He never set out to be a legend, yet time has made him part of one. And when you listen to Ace of Spades or Overkill again, do you feel as though he's still playing somewhere between the drums, the bass, and the silence of immortal souls? Leave a comment below to honor Fast Eddie Clarke, the last man standing from Motörhead's legendary trio. If you love stories behind rock's greatest icons, hit like and subscribe to our channel. And join us as we keep exploring the lives that made the world stop and listen.